Okay, today I want to try to see if I can roll out two different related concepts. The first concept comes from a gentleman named Max Neef, and these are called Satisfiers. And the second concept is my own, and I call it Reinvention. So, Satisfiers. The idea here is to recognize that human societies come together to, among other things, find ways to more effectively satisfy human needs. So, for example, we have some number of basic human needs that we're endeavoring to figure out how to resolve. We need to eat, we need to sleep, um, and we construct different solutions to finding ways to satisfy those needs. So, I'd imagine that back in the old days, we would figure out different tools and techniques for hunting or for gathering and for preparing the things that are gathered into edible food. And these are satisfiers. And these are culturally invented and culturally propagated tools. In the modern era, we go out to a restaurant or we make money and go to a grocery store. On occasion, we maybe grow our own food. But the idea is that this is a basic general framework, the idea of satisfiers. And the important insight of satisfiers is to recognize that there's two components. One is the underlying need, the thing that actually, in the sense, is very solid and enduring. Under most human societies, to eat is going to be a problem to be solved. And then there's the much more ephemeral actual satisfier, the way that we go about doing it. Now, if you think about the frameworks from some of the previous episodes around, I guess I didn't describe attractors yet, but fitness landscapes are reasonably close, or phase spaces, or the way that complicated systems feed back on each other in the Tantra Plus model. We can also notice that satisfiers tend to get entangled with each other. So, for example, as I described it earlier, if you want to go to the grocery store to buy food, you also need to figure out how to go about getting money to be able to buy the food. So now the food satisfier is linked up also to another satisfier associated with, in this case, productivity and how to produce goods and services in the economy. So within the satisfier concept, there's only a few more things to roll out, and then I can move on to reinvention. One is that we can actually notice that satisfiers can be related in a bit of a continuum, that there are good satisfiers that effectively go about meeting our needs, and then there are satisfiers that are less effective at meeting our needs. But better than good satisfiers are, in fact, what Neef calls synergistic satisfiers. So this is a satisfier that maybe meets multiple needs simultaneously. Say, for example, going on a picnic, which might meet needs around being in nature and conviviality with other human beings, and possibly surfacing potential mating opportunities or creative collaboration opportunities, in addition to eating, which is very different than, say, having pizza delivered to your house and just eating it. And then the opposite side of the spectrum are satisfiers that show up as meeting your need but don't. Say, for example, say a piece of fast food that doesn't actually have any nutritional value. Or even worse, is a satisfier that actually makes the problem worse. So, say, for example, a beverage like, say, Coca-Cola that presents itself as satisfying the need for thirst, for water, but in fact actually makes you thirstier. Okay, so that's the continuum of satisfiers to keep in mind. So now to the topic of reinvention. If we notice that we are surrounded by a social milieu of different satisfiers that are operating at differential levels of effectiveness on this continuum. Some are synergistic, and some are, in fact, inhibitory. And yet we also notice that there are fundamental human needs and that these satisfiers relate to each other in a very complicated fashion. We can then imagine grasping a particular social institution that shows up in the contemporary environment, in the environment that we're in, and endeavor to undergo a process that I'm calling reinvention. So let's take journalism as an example. So first order, to reinvent, we have to recognize that the thing that we are dealing with is a satisfier, not the underlying need itself. So journalism is not meaningful, or is not meaningfully understood as, say, for example, the media itself. Journalism is not newspapers. Journalism is not television news. It's not even meaningfully the processes that work within and give rise to those institutional structures. So journalism is not what you learn at journalism school. Journalism isn't the processes about how one goes about doing good editorial. These are all functional adaptive structures inside a particular institutional framework that, to a greater or lesser extent, makes that framework actually deliver on the need, but they aren't the thing itself. So the thing we have to do is we have to, in some sense, kind of turn up the temperature at a conceptual level and boil away the accidents, boil away the artifacts of how we have gone about satisfying a certain need until we get closer and closer to the much more solid, enduring core of what that need might be. So in the case of journalism, we might say that the essence or the core of journalism is a deeply fundamental social need to effectively source and disseminate and make sense of our environment at a social level. So to use the concepts of sovereignty, journalism is associated with the perception and the intelligence portions of sovereignty at a social level. And so there are many of us, and you might imagine, for example, in the older times, that there's a good hunting ground over there. And so journalism is the process where the people who have discovered that information bring it back and share that information with the larger tribe so that that information is effectively disseminated throughout the whole, and now the whole can now process that information. Perhaps an elder has an interesting insight on previous times where we've had similar situations, and the collective intelligence is able to make better choices and engage in more effective activity. So it's part of a form of group sovereignty. And as such, you might say that the journalism is actually neatly connected to science. Science is also part of that same complex. It tends to maybe go more in depth about getting more clarity on what is the nature of things, more about what is true, whereas journalism is more about what is. But these two things are related very closely into the broader problem of collective sense-making. And so what you can then do is say, okay, great, let's take the recognition that things change and that one particular satisfier of an underlying need, say, for example, the newspapers and television news that we developed during the 19th and 20th century, may need to be reinvented. So great, we'll do what we just did. We'll turn the temperature up. We'll try to cause ourselves to be able to separate from the frameworks and architectures that exist now. Boil it down to the core essence, recognize that there's this really deep, enduring social function. And then the last step is then begin the process of endeavoring to redesign satisfiers in the contemporary environment. Say, okay, great. We certainly do need to have a capacity to do social sense-making, do collaborative sense-making. But we actually have new tools. We have new mechanisms to go about gathering information from the edge, perspectives from a larger social whole, bringing that information and putting it in the hands or in the minds of those individuals or groups who are most effectively able to make sense of it, and then allow that sense-making itself to propagate out so that people have access to the best perspectives and the best wisdom that's available in the larger whole. Okay, so then we just need to start thinking about what does that look like in the contemporary environment. And what I'd like to do, just to close, and I think I'm getting to the end of the attention span of the contemporary human, is think about this in the context of the complicated and the complex. We have a proposition that we are reaching the end of the useful life of complicated structures, and that perhaps the appropriate approach as we're engaging in redesign, as we're engaging in reinvention, is to contemplate how we might solve problems, how we might generate satisfiers in a fashion that is more fully in alignment with complexity. And so here, for example, our friend Dave Snowden has already done deep work. He's proposed an approach he calls the human sensor network, whereby every individual human, symmetrically, meaning everybody, plays a role in sensing the environment and then in providing that sensing and sense-making back into a shared social milieu, and then also in curating what is from perception into sense and then finally into meaning. And then this can then be handed off to a different structure that's associated with choice making. I think that's all I want to do right now. If there's interest, perhaps in the next video, I'll dig a little bit deeper into what this human sensor network might look like and how it quite distinctly is different from social media and different from a very pure information approach that is this weird intermediary space between the complicated and the complex that is the kind of the instinctual response that we have without thinking deeply about the nature of what the needs are that we're trying to solve and what the tools are that we have to solve them with. So